This is not a diplomatic disagreement, not a trade spat, and not a temporary crisis that will fade with the next election cycle. This is a structural rupture in the global order, and as of this moment, the United States is being quietly but deliberately pushed out of the alliances it once built, led, and dominated, without a vote, without a press conference, and without a formal declaration. Because world leaders have chosen a far more effective method than confrontation. They are reorganizing power without Washington. And tonight, senior diplomats across Europe and Asia privately describe what is happening using one phrase: strategic bypass. What amounts to a soft ban, an exclusion enforced not by sanctions or expulsions, but by treaties signed elsewhere. Meetings held without American seats, and economic systems redesigned to function smoothly in America's absence. And the implications are historic, because when allies stop coordinating with you, when markets stop prioritizing you, and when security partners stop trusting you, the result is indistinguishable from a ban. And this moment did not begin with tanks or tariffs, but with words. Specifically, with a statement made last week by President Donald Trump during a televised interview in which he claimed that America's NATO allies stayed a little back, a little off the front lines, during the war in Afghanistan. A remark that may have sounded like familiar domestic rhetoric to a US audience, but landed like a diplomatic shockwave across allied capitals, because it directly contradicted the lived experience and documented sacrifice of those nations. The United Kingdom having lost 457 service members, Canada 158, Germany 59, and Denmark one of the highest per capita casualty rates of the entire coalition. Soldiers who fought and died in Helmand Province and Kandahar alongside American forces. And when the President of the United States appeared to dismiss that bloodshed, the response was immediate and unprecedented, with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer issuing a rare public rebuke, calling the comments appalling and insulting, and Germany's Defence Minister Boris Pistorius breaking long-standing diplomatic protocol by demanding an apology on national television, stating that it was disrespectful and untrue to rewrite the history of Allied war dead. And this was not mere outrage or bruised pride, but a fundamental breach of trust. Because NATO's Article 5, the promise that an attack on one is an attack on all, rests entirely on the belief that the United States values the sacrifices of its allies as equal to its own. And when that belief erodes, the alliance becomes a hollow contract, prompting European leaders to ask a question they had quietly avoided for years. If the American president does not respect past sacrifice, how reliable is his promise of future defense? And that question marked the turning point, because it reframed Trump's behavior not as a storm to be endured, but as a climate change to be adapted to, triggering a shift from anger to action, with Europe responding not through speeches, but through structure. The first visible move coming from Brussels, where the European Parliament voted to freeze the ratification of a major US-EU trade agreement, explicitly citing Washington's treatment of Denmark over Greenland and the erosion of trust within NATO. A decision that weaponized time itself because trade agreements take years to negotiate and moments to suspend, sending a clear signal that economic integration with the United States is no longer automatic. And Canada followed with something even more consequential when Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered what analysts now describe as the most important Canadian foreign policy speech in decades, warning that integration had become subordination and declaring that the Atlantic Alliance, as previously understood, had reached a rupture point. A speech that was not a threat, but a pivot announcement, signaling Canada's intent to diversify partnerships and reduce dependence on the United States. And then came the Arctic development, quieter but more chilling, as 7 Arctic nations, all NATO members except the US, advanced plans for regional security coordination without inviting Washington. No announcement, no justification, just exclusion, which in geopolitics often speaks louder than any press release. And to understand why this matters, one must understand the Greenland factor, often dismissed by Americans as absurd, but viewed in Europe as emblematic of a deeper problem. Because President Trump's renewed push to acquire Greenland from Denmark, framed as strategic necessity, was followed by tariff threats when Denmark refused, a move that Nordic nations interpreted not as negotiation, but as coercion, raising alarms in Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland that alliance membership no longer guaranteed protection from American pressure, prompting them to accelerate defense coordination within European frameworks rather than US-led NATO structures. And all of these tensions converged on a single decisive moment on January 27, 2026, when, while Washington argued internally about tariffs and withdrawal strategies, Brussels and New Delhi finalized what European officials openly called the mother of all trade deals. A free trade agreement encompassing more than 2 billion people, eliminating tariffs on 96% of EU exports to India, a stunning concession from one of the world's most historically protectionist economies, with German automobile tariffs dropping from 110% to 10%, wine tariffs slashed from 150%, and machinery, chemical, and pharmaceutical barriers dismantled, while India gained near-total tariff-free access to European markets for textiles, leather goods, jewelry, and other labor-intensive exports, employing millions. And the timing was no coincidence, because as the United States imposed reciprocal tariffs ranging from 25% to 40%, Europe and India were dismantling barriers between themselves, creating a classic trade diversion scenario in which European producers gain permanent footholds in the fastest-growing consumer market on Earth, while American exporters face rising walls. And this is the essence of the soft ban strategy. Because while removing the United States from NATO or the WTO would be legally complex, relevance can be withdrawn quietly through reduced intelligence sharing, rerouted supply chains, meetings held before Americans arrive, and decisions made elsewhere. And this is now happening in real time, with the G7 increasingly functioning as a G6+1. European defense planning assuming American unpredictability, India hedging away from reliance on Washington within the Quad, and even long-standing partners like Japan and South Korea deepening independent diplomatic channels with Europe, not out of hostility, but out of risk management. Because the world is not anti-American, but post-dependence. And the cost to the United States is already emerging, despite arguments from the White House that tariffs will force companies to reshore and rebuild domestic industry. And while there have been headline-grabbing investment pledges, such as Japan's $550 billion commitment, economists warn that pledges are not factories and often evaporate under economic stress, while the immediate reality is higher consumer prices and the deeper danger is lost access. Because American farmers and manufacturers once relied on Europe and Asia as export anchors. But when European producers can sell into India tariff-free and Americans cannot, buyers choose Europe. And once those markets are lost, they rarely return. Because shelf space, supplier relationships, and brand trust are long-term assets. And by the time Washington seeks re-entry, the Indian market will already be saturated with European goods, illustrating how superpower status erodes not through dramatic collapse, but through quiet irrelevance. And historians may one day look back on early 2026 as the moment the post-World War II order ended, not with a war or a treaty collapse, but with a collective decision by allies to ensure themselves against American unpredictability. Because Donald Trump promised to put America first, and in one sense he has succeeded, with America now first in tariffs, first in isolation, and first in uncertainty, but increasingly last in the rooms where the future is written. And while there is no official ban, no document expelling the United States from NATO, when allies build new economic and security architectures without you, the outcome is the same: The door closes quietly. And tonight, the critical question facing Washington is not whether this outcome is fair, but whether it is reversible. Because the ink on the EU-India deal is dry. The supply chains are already shifting. The meetings are already happening without American chairs. And, if the world has learned how to function without the United States at its center, the return ticket may no longer exist, leaving America to confront a reality it has not faced in a century. Flying solo in a world that has moved on.